reached now the concluding session today on Maimonides and the Maimonidean Controversies. And today I should like to concentrate on the one of the last rounds, not the very last, but at least for us it will be the last one, the last round of the controversy in the beginning of the 14th century. To be exact, between 1303 and 1305. We may recall that in the previous round of the polemics on Maimonides and his writings in 1232, that stage was finished with a ban on Maimonides' works, and the result was that the Papal Inquisition condemned to burning the books of Maimonides. And that act left a very profound influence on some of the participants in the controversy, particularly one of the champions of the anti-Maimonidean camp, Rabbi Jonah Girondi, who advocated the ban and enthusiastic fighter for the traditions of Franco Germany in Spain. He apparently was so sorry that he put an end to his active participation in the controversy. A few years later, when the copies of the Talmud were burned in the streets of Paris, he and some of his colleagues saw, and particularly the Maimonidean camp, saw in the burning of the Talmud in the streets of Paris as a punishment from God for the internal strife that tore apart the Jews in Spain, Provence, and elsewhere. And so when we reach the beginning of the 14th century, the polemics changed their course completely. It was they changed their course, the character changed. It was totally now different in contents, although probably it was a tactical change. But in any case, when the controversy broke out again at the beginning of the 14th century, in 1303, it was no longer Maimonides, it was not Maimonides' works that were now challenged or questioned, but the allegorical exegesis, the allegorical interpretation of scriptures that were declared dangerous to the continuation of Judaism. We know little from direct evidence about the allegorical interpretations, although we do have some works from the 13th century in which we can have good examples of allegorical interpretation of the Bible. But most of the material we have, in fact, is from sources that are anti-Maimonidean, and they bring us examples of such allegorization of biblical text, and I'll give a few examples in a few moments. The allegorical exegesis, of course, was attributed to the rationalist camp, to the Maimonidean camp. What was the danger of the allegorical interpretation as far as the anti-Maimonidean, or if you like, the traditionalist camp, although I don't know how they came to be known as such, as a traditionalist. Now, the allegorization of the biblical text, of course, it was nothing new. The Midrash is full of such allegories where we have on stories of the Bible interpretations in the Midrash that are certainly allegorical. The rabbis give the figurative interpretation of stories, of various stories. Those of you who are acquainted with the Midrash will know they're full of them. Do not think Abraham and Sarah were just like, or the 4 kings and the 5 kings, or the rivers, etc. They give interpretations. Now, the danger, however, that the rationalists, the anti-rationalists, saw was not so much the allegorization of the stories in the narratives in the of the Bible, but they were afraid that the allegorical interpretations would penetrate also the part of the commandments. The commandments will also be interpreted allegorically and therefore will be devoid of any practical sense. You will no longer be expected to put on tefillin because this is just figurative. It's just like you should put them in your heart, so you shall bind them on your hand, and it will no longer be interpreted as the tefillin, the phylacteries that Jews are supposed, according to halakha, to put on, bind on their hands and on their heads. So this is the danger as they saw it, and therefore they began their struggle against such allegorizations. But what started as a war against the allegorization of the biblical text turned in the end into a fight against the curriculum, against the program of education that was upheld by the Maimonideans, by the rationalists. And this is, of course, we reach a stage now in the beginning of the 14th century that the struggle between the rationalists and the anti-rationalists about the contents of Jewish education. What do we teach our children? What is the curriculum of the academy where the children and the grown-ups study? The possibility of studying Greek wisdom, as they called it, Chochma Yevanit, Greek wisdom, that is philosophy and science, or external sciences, Chochmot Chitzoniot, external sciences, at the same time that one studies Torah, was seen by one of the camps as an impossible contradiction. There could be no such a thing in the eyes of the anti-rationalists that at the same time that you study Torah, you study Greek wisdom, because they are contradictory. You cannot make them compatible, and therefore this should be the struggle to achieve a change, a radical change in the education system, in the curriculum, in the syllabus that was used in the yeshivot, in the academies at the time. It is interesting to note that once again, the initiative was taken by a Jew from Provence, just as you may recall in the previous round, the first steps were taken by Shlomo Minhahar Solomon of Montpellier from Provence. This time again we have a Provençal Jew, Abba Mari, or his Provençal name, Astruc de Lunel. Musical accompaniment. So once again we have here a Provençal Jew, Abba Mari, who began the whole polemics. Abba Mari was extremely worried, and his correspondence, we have it, his and other people's correspondence at the time, it's a whole volume. And the volume today, it's called Minchat Kenaot. Minchat Kenaot, or offering of zeal, that's the best translation I can think of at the moment. Minchat Kenaot is a collection of dozens of letters that were exchanged at the time between 1303, 1305, between various people, but it must be emphasized, most of them were all in the anti-Maimonidean camp. And this is the problem. We have to realize that most of the sources that we find in Minchat Kenaot reflect the ideas of the anti-rationalist camp and not the Maimonidean side. Today, for those of you who know Hebrew, apart from the original, well, not the original, the first published text, I think it was in 1838 in Pressburg. Apart from that, there is a new critical edition by Dimitrovsky, which makes, of course, life very easy because he brings all the various manuscripts and the critical edition by Dimitrovsky and is available. But unfortunately, we do not have the translation of the entire book, but there are certain passages that have been translated in various works that are on the subject. Now, in Minchat Kenaot, we can follow the whole polemics very easily, as long as we remember that we are reading sources reflecting the ideas of one camp and not the other. So, why again in Provence? It's interesting. Provence seems to be the place where things were really very agitated. The spiritual, religious, intellectual crisis, agitation was there. It seems to me that the explanation very probably lies in the fact that unlike Spain, where there were the two camps and there was a struggle, things were not so novel. They were not so new. There was a tradition from the Muslim period that was transferred to the Hispanic kingdoms in Christian Spain, and therefore, despite the differences of opinion, there was nothing completely new in this. Whereas in Provence, we have here a community that was exposed to something totally new. Provence, of course it was not France. That's why I purposely I'm using the word Provence and not the south of France, so that we do not think we are dealing with France and Rachid and the Tossafis. Provence was an entirely different community, with a different tradition, with different understanding of Judaism. It was a community between Franco-Germany and Spain, but it was there that some of the Jews from Andalusia in the middle of the 12th century, with the Almohadic invasion in 1148-49, that settled. It was there that some of the refugees settled. I may have mentioned the names of the most famous two families, but by no means were there two. There were many families, but the most important ones were the Kimchi and the Ibn Tibon families.
Where is Provence in France? What section?
Provence, it is not the Provence of France exactly today. Provence is a region in French history and in France today, which is from Marseille northwards, the whole area of Aix-en-Provence and Marseille and Nice, and all this part northwards. But when we use the word Provence in Jewish history, we mean the whole of the south of France, which includes particularly the region called Languedoc. And the reason why I say this is because the most important part of Provence from a Jewish point of view was not Provence as the French call today the region, but Languedoc. And the reason why we call it Provence is interesting. The Jews retained in many parts of the Mediterranean world the Roman names. And Rome, of course, gave the name of Provence, Provincia, the first region that was conquered by them outside Italy. That was the province, the first province under their, and that's how the name was known. And therefore, the whole area, those of you who are acquainted with French geography, Provence, Languedoc, Comtat-Venaissin, Roussillon, the whole area of the south of France, what they call the Midi, it's all Provence from the Jewish point of view. So it was there we're talking about. And there, where the Ibn Tibon and Kimchi families settled together with other Jews from Andalusia, they brought with them the Andalusian tradition, Jewish philosophy, etc. And there they realized that the Jews in Provence did not know anything from the vast literature that was written in Judeo-Arabic. And they began a program of translations, one of the most important from the point of view of Judaism as well as the development of the Hebrew language. Because Ibn Tibon, particularly the Ibn Tibon family, brought to the Hebrew language dozens of new words that did not exist in Hebrew, that the Jews did not use. Of course, the mentality and the concept of every nation are reflected in their language. The Jews, for example, did not have a word for nature. The Hebrew word for nature today, for the past 800 years or so, is what? Is teva. Teva. Tet, bet, ayin. And yet, you go and look in the Bible, in the Talmud, and Mishnah, you will not find the word nature. And the first time, the Tibonites had to use the word teva, and they borrowed it from Arabic. Right? And the word world, olam, of course it is found in the Bible, but it doesn't mean world in the Bible. It means eternity. It means a period of time, a very long period of time. Never is it used in the sense of the world. Here, the first time that the word was used again, and there are dozens of words for the first time were introduced into the Hebrew language. By whom? By these people who felt the necessity to translate the Judeo-Arabic books, the traditions of the Jews in the Muslim world, and particularly in Spain, into Hebrew. And here there is a development. And Provençal Jews were exposed for the first time to a literature hitherto unknown, that they never knew about its existence. Saadia Gaon's Maimonides, Ibn Yehuda Halevi's, Ibn Gabirol, all these works, they were translated now into Hebrew, and Provençal Jews were divided immediately into two camps. Those who were full of admiration, they were really so excited, they were so enthusiastic about what they now started to learn. And of course, this camp was totally Maimonidean, and it is important to say that the translations were not done just like this. People, Ibn Tibon could not afford to sit down and translate a whole day and publish. He was supported by rich Jews in Provence who became the admirers of Maimonides and of the Judeo-Arabic tradition in general. They financially supported the whole program of translations. Dozens of works were translated. I think I said it, that Shmuel ibn Tibon was translating the Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide for the Perplexed, while Maimonides was still alive. And he corresponded with him, and he asked him, what do you think? So that we have a translation that was... Now, so this is Provence, and where these things... We understand, therefore, why this excitement, why this agitation, because there were other Jews in Provence who saw in the newly discovered Judeo-Arabic tradition a grave danger to the very existence of Judaism. They thought that now Jews in Provence who will adopt this rationalization of Judaism will actually abandon the observance of the precepts in Judaism because this is what they thought the inevitable result of such a intellectual and religious development. And so we have here Abba Mari extremely worried. Now in the second stage, after the first round, we have Abba Mari who wrote for the first time to a Spanish rabbi, Rabbi Shlomo ben Adret. Rabbi Shlomo ben Adret is one of the greatest halachic scholars of Spain at the time, the end of the 13th, the beginning of the 14th century. To give you an idea, what we know today is published as well as manuscript responsa, 10,000 of them we have. 10,000. He gave legal decisions, so many legal decisions, 10,000. It gives an idea how busy he was, how popular he was. His authority was acknowledged in various parts of the world, not only in the Iberian Peninsula, but in the whole of Western Europe. And he was the one to whom Abba Mari addressed his first letter. You are the great authority. It is up to you now to put an end to the catastrophic situation in which we are now in Spain and Provence, where our children are exposed to the rationalist interpretation of Judaism, and where we are slowly, gradually adopting allegorical interpretations of the Bible, with the inevitable result that there is a laxity in the observance of the commandments. And we are amazed at Shlomo ben Adret's answer. Shlomo ben Adret says, no, if you think there is such a danger in Provence, then you take the initiative. You are the Baal Abayit. You are here. You are a Provençal rabbi. We don't have such a problem in Spain. Why I say it's amazing? Amazing because, first of all, he was going to take an action later on. And according to the descriptions we have, there was a problem in Spain. So how is it possible that Adret should present or should answer in such a way, presenting Spain as a peaceful community without any religious, intellectual, spiritual problems? I am not very sure whether we have the answer. There are various books on the subject in which the whole point is completely ignored, but which is, of course, the easiest thing to do. When you don't have an answer to a question, you don't ask the question, you don't give the answer. But the question is here important. Why did he, is it conceivable that he was lying? My suggestion is that we should consider his answer taking into account the conditions in Spain at the time, that Adret was really very careful not to start a new fight. He was afraid particularly of the reaction of the leaders of the communities in Spain in general and in the Crown of Aragon in particular, who might have been very much against any kind of ban against rationalism and against the curriculum of studies that was used at the time, and he probably wanted to avoid any such fight, or he thought he might, in any case, you will not be able to obtain, to achieve your goal, and better not to start any fight. Abba Mari did not give up. He went on and on and on. And in Hebrew, we call it nudnik. Right? He didn't stop. He went on, and he put pressure, and he traveled, and he sent messengers, and there was no end until, of course, in the end. It is possible that he also asked certain other rabbis to interfere, one of whom was Rabbi Asher ben Yechiel. Rabbi Asher ben Yechiel, the Rosh, the disciple of Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg from Germany. He was on his way to Spain, and he passed through Barcelona. And we know that the two rabbis, Rabbi Asher ben Yechiel of Germany and Rabbi Shlomo ben Adret of Barcelona, sat there and spoke about a variety of subjects, about a lot of subjects. And then Asher ben Yechiel continued his journey to Toledo, where he would become the rabbi of one of the main synagogues in Toledo. But there is no doubt about it. Rabbi Asher ben Yechiel, in his meetings with Adret, that he tried to convince him that it was necessary to take actions against what was considered by Abba Mari and by Asher ben Yechiel himself, a German rabbi, an Ashkenazi rabbi, as a very dangerous situation. It is amazing how we see here the correspondence across the Pyrenees. The French rabbis, some German rabbis, Provençal rabbis, and the Spanish ones, they were all corresponding all the time. As I said, in Hadkinot, we have this collection of correspondence. By no means the entire collection. I'm sure that there were more letters that were not included. And at long last, we have the ban. We have a cherem pronounced. The cherem, who pronounced it? Who signed it? Where was it published, proclaimed? It was proclaimed in Barcelona, where Adret 2 years earlier said, we have no such a problem. If you don't have such a problem, why do you proclaim a ban? What happened in 2 years? Could the situation change so drastically from 1303 to 1305? But the ban was actually double. There were two bans. One ban was against the study of the works of the Greeks and natural sciences or metaphysics in the original or in translation before the age of 25, except medicine and the works of Jewish philosophers. Notice, it is against the study of natural sciences, metaphysics, and so on, except medicine and the works of Jewish philosophers. So it is here clear that Maimonides was not included in the ban. In fact, no Jewish philosopher was included in the ban. You just don't study Greek philosophy. You don't study philosophy, sciences, everything, except medicine, and medicine, of course, there you could. But some people think that this ban is very, very liberal, is very moderate, because after all, it only forbids the study of these sciences and philosophy until the age of 25. And in any case, medicine is included. Jewish philosophy of Maimonides, for example, is excluded, and therefore they think it is a very moderate cherem. Particularly if you were to ask people like Maimonides. Maimonides never thought that you can teach sciences and philosophy and so on at the age of 12, 13, 14. He too thought that at a certain age, you can start only at a certain age. So people, some scholars think that this is really a compromise and a very moderate ban. But compromise or not, the ban was of course met with anger, with a very, very deep anger by all those who were for Maimonides and for the Judeo-Arabic tradition as it was understood until that time. Now that is the first ban. The second ban, it was against allegorical interpretations of scriptures of any sort by anyone, Jews or non-Jews. The second ban aroused no opposition. And this is interesting. Nobody spoke against it. It seems that everybody accepted the second ban, even the rationalists. This, I think, strengthens my opinion that the problem of the allegorical interpretations almost did not exist, and the whole thing was for other purposes. It was suggested for other purposes. But the first one, as I said, aroused very strong criticism and opposition. And immediately there was a counter-ban, of course. When you have a ban, you have a counter-ban. It is interesting that those people who oppose the ban are people who are far from being Jews known for their laxity in religious observance. For example, Rabbi Menachem HaMeiri. Rabbi Menachem HaMeiri might not be known to you, but he was one of the great scholars at the time. He lived in Perpignan, in today's in the south of France. In those days, it was part of the Crown of Aragon and Catalan-speaking region. But he is very famous for his commentary on the Talmud, a commentary called the Bet HaBechira, the house, or the chosen house, probably, a reference to the temple, maybe. But in any case, in his commentary, we see him as a very interesting interpreter of Judaism. He is considered by Professor Katz, for example, as the first rabbi who changed his completely, he presented Christianity in a new light. He is considered to be the first one to think of Christianity as a pure monotheistic religion, and that he was the one who began to speak or write about Christianity in terms that were completely different from his predecessors. And maybe Professor Katz is right, that at least as far as late times is concerned, he was, of course, the pioneer of a new attitude towards Christianity. But he himself was never suspected of any heretical tendencies. On the contrary, he was a very respected rabbi, and he opposed the ban, he wrote against the ban, and he reminded Adret, whom he respected very much, the failure of the 1232 ban and its tragic consequences. And he said to him, you will never be able to eradicate ideas by banning them. You will never be able to put an end to a intellectual and religious polemics by banning one side. And furthermore, he said, sciences are necessary. They are even necessary for the proper understanding of the Talmud. Not only are they important in themselves, but we need them in order to understand a lot of passages in the Talmud. So here we have Menachem HaMeiri, his rabbi of his caliber, of his status, opposing the ban of 1305, which, as I said, was seen by many as a moderate ban, a compromise. Another great opponent of the ban was Yedaya Bedersi from Béziers, that's why Bedersi, and he is a known philosopher. Yedaya Bedersi wrote a long letter, which he called Letter of Apology. It was an ironical letter. It's full of satire, and he is against the anti-rationalists, and he sent the letter to Adret again. He says that it is thanks to the philosophy of Andalusian rabbis, the Sephardi scholars, that we are able to explain the Bible properly. It is thanks to the Andalusian school that we are able to see the Bible in the proper way, because had it not been for the Andalusian school of thought, we would have still been trapped in an understanding of the Bible which is totally false. And he is referring, of course, to the anthropomorphic passages in the Torah, which were accepted literally by so many Jews, and Maimonides, and of course the whole school before him in Andalusia, just put an end to it, that you don't think of God as in physical terms, that all the references in the Torah to God are by necessity human terms, and we should understand the divinity, God, as an absolutely spiritual being in the way Maimonides presented. And he says, this, only for this reason, yet he said, we have to behave with respect towards those Jewish philosophers against whose ideas the ban actually is proclaiming. He understood, actually, properly, although Jewish philosophy was not included in the ban, he understood the implications, because Adret was a very wise rabbi. He understood that if he were to pronounce a ban against Maimonides, certainly, but against Jewish philosophy in general, that this would not be accepted. But if he were to pronounce against philosophy and sciences in general, that might have a better chance to succeed. And yet he says to him, you are actually putting the clock backward. You are bringing us back to a few generations earlier, where we, like the Jews of France and Germany, we would have the wrong conceptions about God and about the biblical text. He asked Adret to cancel the ban, just to admit that it was a mistake and that this ban should. Again, the polemics between Jews at the time, in Provence particularly, and to a large extent in Spain, came to an end with what? With an external intervention. But this time it was not the burning of anybody's book, it was an expulsion of the Jews. The expulsion of the Jews from France, including Languedoc, where the majority of Provençal Jewry lived, put an end to this, because Philippe le Bel in 1306, he expelled all the Jews, and this again was seen by many Jews as a divine intervention, the result of the strife that tore apart the Jews in that part of the world. And obviously they had no time now and no clear mind to continue fighting when they lost their homes, they lost their communities, and they were now looking for haven to find refuge. This is the end of this part of the struggle. Now, it is clear that the two sides struggling now were the following. Those scholars who looked who saw in the Torah and the Halakha the sole authority, yes, the sole authority, against those who considered philosophy and sciences, all branches of learning, to be necessary additional tools for not only to make life easier, but also to make the Torah better understood. That these two concepts were actually struggling against each other is obvious, and the opponents of the study of science and philosophy aimed at achieving a goal that was to put an end to a tradition that began a few centuries earlier with the encounter of Judaism with Greek science and philosophy, and when Judaism was exposed to the new trend as a result of the expansion of the Muslim world, and that was this now was the attempt to put an end to a few generations from the 9th century until now the 14th century. All that was achieved in the Judeo-Arabic culture. This is, of course, most interesting because it must be seen in its proper context. In the first round in Jewish history was in Hellenistic times, when again, and of course, it is always easy to present the struggle between two extremes, but often, in fact, it is not the two extremes. There are two camps. Sometimes some moderate people in the two camps did not interpret things as the extremists in those did. We have to realize that they were not just all in black and white. And therefore here, this time, we have this struggle between the two parties. The party that aimed at invalidating the Judeo-Arabic culture that came from Spain, did not start in Spain, it is true, but reached its maturity in Spain, I think had at least 10 points in the program that was designed to cancel all the achievements of Judeo-Arabic culture. The first thing, what they wanted to do, in my opinion, is to put an end to Maimonides' influence. Maimonides' influence, according to them, must be cancelled. And how? Is by destroying his halachic authority. If you show that his halachic decisions were not on solid grounds, you can actually destroy his prestige, and this way his influence would be cancelled. This is the first point. The second point is the prohibition of the study of the books, the two books of Maimonides, that is the Guide for the Perplexed, which brings a rationalist interpretation of the commandments, and we had occasion to give one or two examples, and of course his book of knowledge. His book of knowledge in Mishneh Torah, Sefer Hamadan, where for the first time, as you may recall, he enumerated all the beliefs, the doctrines that every Jew must adhere to. And this is, of course, unlike all the other books in Mishneh Torah, the 13 books of Mishneh Torah. In the book of knowledge, we have not halakha, not what to do and what not to do, but what to think and what not to think, what to believe and what not to believe, something that the anti-Maimonideans thought it never existed in Judaism. So the attempt to present beliefs as doctrines of Judaism must also be stopped, and the attempt also to rationalize the mitzvot, to give reasons for the mitzvot, as Maimonides did in every one of them. Yes, in every one of them. And the attempt to rationalize the miracles and everything must be stopped, because otherwise this would lead to lack of faith, of belief, and in the end you stop practicing. This is, of course, what the anti-rationalists believed and thought. The third point in their program was to forbid the study of science, philosophy, and theology in general. Apart from medicine, everything must be banned. The fourth point, to declare as heretical any religious deviation, any idea that is not compatible with what they considered to be Judaism. And the fifth point, to forbid the possession of scientific, philosophical books. You can see if these, I am presenting this on the basis of the correspondence of all the attacks against Maimonides and so on. These are far more extreme than what the ban implied. But this is what they wanted, and the ban is only a diplomatic document that took into account the possibilities that were at their disposal at the time, and to forbid any kind of interpretation which may be considered allegorical, because here we have instances that are quoted, or you think the book of the Bible has the time really to tell us stories about Abraham and Sarah, about Lot and his daughters? Is that what the Bible is about? They thought it's impossible. You have to think far beyond. Of course, for the simple man, for those people who are really restricted in their understanding, yes, they will read stories, the story of Joseph, the story of Jacob, but for us intellectuals, for people whose understanding is deep, whose background enable them to see things in their proper context, the biblical text cannot be that simple. And therefore they, according to the anti-rationalists, what did the rationalists doing? What were they doing? They were, in fact, detaching the biblical text from the historical background. Abraham and Sarah are not just the patriarch and the matriarch. They're the two ideas. They're the 4 kings and the 5 kings. What is it so interesting that the Bible should tell us about the war that took place between the 4 kings against the 5 kings, except if we think here in other terms, philosophical terms, the 4 elements of which the world is composed, and the 5 senses that man possessed. There we see, of course, a different type of struggle. And the rivers of Gan Eden, of paradise, that the Genesis tells us about. What is so important that 4 rivers, unless of course we interpret this figuratively, allegorically. But then of course the anti-Maimonideans say, the anti-rationalists say this is not the end, because you go on interpreting more and more texts, including then the commandments. Remember what, I don't know if I said it, about Maimonides and Maimonides, different interpretations of, or different opinions about the time when God commanded the establishment of a tabernacle. I can't remember if we referred to this. Now, in Exodus, we have, of course, the first commandment, that the first time when the Jews, the Israelites, were commanded to erect a tabernacle and all the details. Now, there is an interesting differences of opinion between Maimonides and Maimonides. Of course, they never met. They did not live at the same time. Slightly afterwards, Maimonides, but nevertheless is in their writings. Maimonides, in his commentary on the Torah, he opposed very strongly Maimonides' interpretation of the facts. Maimonides, if you look in Exodus, you will see the whole idea of the tabernacle comes after the golden calf, the whole episode of the golden calf. And Maimonides said that is the right place where, did we not speak about it?
Yes.
We did. In that case, we don't need to repeat. But now, what is the whole, what actually the anti-rationalists were afraid of? They were afraid of this kind of interpretation by Maimonides. Maimonides never meant to cancel anything. He gave a kind of a rationalization of the sacrifices of the tabernacle. This is not what God needs, this is what man needs, he says. But therefore we have this commandment. But now, other Maimonideans, those who believed they were following in his footsteps, they would go further, one step further. This is not only this commandment, there are so many other commandments that can be seen, according to Maimonides himself, that were designed to eradicate idol worship, pagan ideas. So, in 13th century or 14th century Spain or Provence, a Jew says, what's got to do with me? I am clean of any kind of pagan tendencies. So, you might come to the conclusion that I don't need to practice this commandment because it was meant to eradicate paganism and I am clean of it. This is the claim of the anti-rationalist, that the rationalization of the commandments and the allegorization of the biblical text would inevitably bring about the dissolution of Judaism and the disaster where the Jews would stop, actually. If you look around in all the literature at the time, it is very difficult to find one serious rabbi with such views that the anti-rationalists are trying to fight. You look in vain. Who was that rabbi of the Maimonidean trend who is leading the Jews to the stop practicing the commandments? And therefore one has to be very careful. I think even though one can believe in the sincerity of the opinions of both sides, sincerity, the belief in one's opinion, do not necessarily mean that they were right, that they really saw the danger as it was in reality. What would have happened, of course, we can never tell, but I insist, if we search for those ideas that are being fought by these anti-rationalists, we will not find a rabbi. There were Jews who did have a certain radical interpretations, and some of them, in fact, converted to Christianity, some others became Christian, but there were not representatives of, certainly Maimonides would not identify himself with them. In all generations you have Jews who left Judaism out of conviction or because they no longer believed. And the anti-Maimonidean camp insisted that all those who criticized the Agadic part of the Talmud should be penalized, should be punished, should be fined, because this kind of neglect and this attitude of the rationalist towards the Agadot, that these are just some stories for the simple-minded people. This, of course, was seen by them as very dangerous, and they had to be stopped. We have to block the path of the side. We have to not to allow them to continue any further, and we have to insist on the observance of the commandments. Now, the 10 points program that was never actually put into practice, they never had the chance to materialize it, was there. So that when certain scholars say, what is so problematic? The ban, after all, in the historical context was a very moderate text, must be seen in actually the proper perspective. The ban was not the document that reflected the ideas of the anti-rationalists. The ban was only a diplomatic document that came from the hands of Adret, Rabbi Shlomo ben Adret, who signed it together with all the leaders in the community in Barcelona. But it was a document that reflected his wise policy of not causing too much trouble, and of a realistic document that took into account the possibilities, realistic examination of the facts, and therefore it does not reflect. That is, I think, the problem with those scholars. I think they misunderstand the document. This is not the document that tells us about the program of the anti-rationalists. The anti-rationalists, had they had the power to do so, they would have banned, they would have eradicated, they would have put an end to an entire interpretation of Judaism that emerged in the course of time from the 9th century onwards as a certain interpretation or concept of Judaism in contrast to the interpretation of Judaism that was upheld north of the Pyrenees in Franco-German circles. And therefore, in Provence and Spain, it was not really the Maimonides that was the issue. It was the clash between these two interpretations of Judaism. On the one hand, the representative of one, Maimonides, but it was a whole Judeo-Arabic culture, tradition, and on the other hand, the Tosafists in the north, the Franco-German Talmudic school of thought that rejected totally the ideas of the rationalist that came from the south. There were two worlds, two concepts of Judaism. In retrospect, one can, of course, see the legitimate existence of both, that the interpretation of both of them may be considered equally legitimate, different opinions and different interpretation of Judaism, but this is really when we look backward in history, we see in fact how the penetration of influence from the north brought about this clash. We don't see any problem in those circles that were brought, educated on the foundations of the Judeo-Arabic tradition, which allowed, on the one hand, the study of philosophy and science, and on the other, insisted on the study of the Torah, but with the concepts of that were prevalent in that part of the world. There, the problem did not exist. The problem did not exist in Franco-German circles, where the Tosafists and Hasidei Ashkenaz were actually the predominant protagonists of a certain concept of Judaism. It was only the borderline between the two worlds, where the two worlds met, where the Judeo-Arabic traditions were presented to Jews for the first time exposed to these in Provence and in northern Spain, and of course the clash between the two camps were therefore, there was therefore right there in Provence and northeastern Spain, because of the proximity, because of the place where the two worlds clashed. The polemics did not come to an end. We'll see in the end of the 14th century, we shall not see because we'll have no time to carry on, but the polemics will continue in the 14th century, will continue in the 15th century, but if we analyze the continuation, we shall see that once the Jews of Spain were expelled, the whole course of Jewish history will change. The Jews of Spain, after 1492, we can say, abandoned completely the original Judeo-Arabic tradition that was initiated by Saadia Gaon and reached its maturity under Maimonides. Because from 1492 onwards, the concept of Judaism that prevailed among the Spanish refugees was a deeply mystical interpretation of Judaism. And therefore we see how interesting it was that a man like Rabbi Yosef Karo, the product of Sephardi Jewry, who would write the Shulchan Aruch, not only was he a deep mystic, but of course mystics were in Spain as well, but he would be opposed by an Ashkenazi rabbi, because in his Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Yosef Karo would say, it is forbidden to study the sciences and philosophy. In fact, in retrospect, it was the Franco-German school of Judaism that had the upper hand, that prevailed. Why and how? How can we explain this? I think the 1391-1492, the century that passed between the massacres of 1391 and the explosion of 1492, brought about a change of mind among the Jews in Spain. It is often the case where when people in fact interpret certain events as intervention of God. The 1391 massacres supposedly put an end to a concept that was prevalent among the Jews, that we can be Jewish and at the same time be involved deeply in the social, economic, cultural, and intellectual life of the country. 1391 massacres were a very heavy blow to this. When the 1492 expulsion came, it was of course the end, finish. The Jews of Spain will leave Spain now with new ideas, with new concepts that were certainly of the camp of the anti-rationalist. The anti-rationalist was composed of mystics, of protagonists of the Kabbalah, and of people who were convinced that the Tosafist interpretation of Judaism of Franco-Germany was the right concept. Now, here we see something interesting. We see how Jews changed their opinion, changed their interpretation of Judaism in accordance with certain political events. With certain political events, this is a very interesting thing. You may see it as a Jewish characteristic, but in reality it is not. Because on the one hand you can say that any time that the Jews suffered a tragedy, they always seem to blame themselves. See, it is because of our sins. It is because of the sins of our fathers that we are suffering, right? But on the other hand, you will see that in many instances, they never blame the concepts that they were upheld. They blame certain behavior. They claim that we misbehaved, but not concepts. And that was, by the way, one of the aspects of the conflict between the church and the synagogue, where the Jews claimed that their political suffering had nothing to do with their religious beliefs. And here we have an abandonment of this kind of concept, where the Jews blamed their own religious beliefs prior to 1492, and they saw in the expulsion the divine intervention, the punishment that came, and they found, rather they looked for the answer in the mystical interpretation of Judaism. It is always, you find it in modern times, but you find it in medieval times, it is always easier to find refuge in something mystical, something very mysterious, and there to find consolation that we do not understand exactly how providence works in this world. And this is how we find in the 1492 expulsion a total deviation from rationalist Judaism of Sepharad of the Middle Ages, and we can say that the grounds for a united front between Sephardi mystics and Ashkenazi Kabbalists would reach their full maturity in the 16th century in Tzfat, in Safed, where Ashkenazim and Sephardim will study together and will produce one united concept of Judaism that would conquer almost the entire Jewish world. But this concept of Judaism was not that of Sepharad, although it is branded, at least in the liturgical traditions, even of Ashkenazi Jews, as the custom of Sepharad. It is a new concept which is totally divorced from that which prevailed in the Middle Ages. Thank you. Those of you who have to leave, of course, can do so without feeling bad, and those who have questions, I will be happy to answer. Yes?
Did you say the conflict between the two camps, the rationalists and the anti-rationalists, led to a similar polemic problem amongst the rabbis concerning what women were allowed to study as well? Was that part of?
Yeah. At the time, the issue of the women's, at the time, you're talking
Yes.
about the 13th, 14th century, there was no such issue. The problem of the status of the women, whether women could, should study or not, was not discussed. As far as I know, there has been no such a discussion.
Well, the discussion was earlier about whether they should study Torah
Yeah,
or
but that's
Mishnah
much earlier.
or Pardes. So wasn't that part of,
No,
I'm asking whether that was a
there is-
reflection of what was going on in the general community.
No, the participation of women in the study of the Torah was discussed in much, much earlier generations, yes, where we find already in the Mishnah and Talmudic sources references to it. It would be, of course, interesting to examine how, for example, one idea expressed by one rabbi became so prevalent in the Jewish world against the ideas of another rabbi who was of a completely different opinion. But it is not a question that was discussed at the time between the two camps. That's why I did not refer to it. It was not discussed. Had the development been different, I don't know, then the issue might have been raised, but it was not. It was not an issue. You wanted to say.
Did the dispute between the rationalists and anti-rationalists continue over the years? Do they still exist? Is this a thing that scholars and philosophers debate even now? Or did that die out in the 1492?
After 1492, we find very little evidence. First of all, Jewish philosophy came to an end, until Spinoza, of course. But Spinoza would no longer find himself within the Jewish camp. Abravanel, who is a philosopher, was a person who lived at the time and after the expulsion, cannot really represent any trend, and very few works of the period after 1492 can be categorized as the representatives of the rationalist trend. There is a complete different change in the course of Judaism after 1492. Mysticism became now the prevalent trend. Every Jew after 1492 thought that the study of the Zohar comes as one of the first texts, if not the first. This was not the case before 1492. This was certainly not the case before 1391. There were mystics. Maimonides was a mystic, and so on. There were mystics in Gerona. There were mystics in Castile. There were mystics in Provence. But nobody taught Kabbalah in public. Nobody thought that every average person, every Jew, should study Kabbalah. It was something that remained for private study among teachers and disciples. After 1492, everyone who knew the alphabet thought that he could be a student of Kabbalah. The Kabbalah was everywhere. Rationalist Judaism, the Maimonidean tradition, there is no evidence at all. In modern times, there's some people who would now begin to reinterpret Judaism in accordance with what they believe to be the Maimonidean interpretation. Probably in our own days, one of the people who did that was Leibovich, Professor Leibovich, who saw himself as a pure Maimonidean and whose very extreme pronouncements against all kinds of practices among Jews nowadays angered many people, but he saw them as in the spirit of Maimonides. That is how his harsh pronouncement against the Western Wall and those who go there to pray, etc., as paganism, idol worship. But of course, a person who calls himself Maimonidean does not necessarily mean that he was. I mean, this is what he considered himself. But there is no evidence in the 16th, 17th century. Judaism now, both in the Ashkenazi world and in the Sephardic world, would enter its Kabbalistic phase, right until the period of the 18th century, the Haskalah movement and the emancipation, and of course the changes in Jewish history will be very radical, but new conditions. Yes?
What would you consider the dispute between Judaism today and
Between the various strands, you're talking about Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox, conservative. Well, I think it would be not possible for me now to give you in one sentence, but if I were to just not to leave you without an answer, I would say that the arguments today between Jews are not concerned with rationalist or mystical interpretation of Judaism. Today, the basic arguments, when we analyze the whole matter clearly, objectively, as much as, of course, humanly possible, I think it is argument about the validity of the halakha, and not so much what type of doctrines and beliefs we have to stick to. The question, I think, that today is disputed and argued is the validity of the halakha. And this has been so, I would say, for the past, from the beginning of modern times, maybe the past 200 and so many years, where some no longer find the halakha valid, and one could reinterpret Judaism accordingly, and those who claim that the halakha is not something that you can do. I think that is more the issue rather than rationalist or mystical interpretation. Because among those people who may be considered one camp today, you find those who would follow Maimonides and those who would follow the Zohar in one camp today. Right? I don't think I gave you a full, but I think I'm going to leave some material for my last lecture. Otherwise, if I say everything now, I will have nothing left. Yes?
Wasn't the study of Greek also prohibited during Talmudic times?
Yes. Well, of course, this issue is quite true, because I did say that the first round of the whole polemics was in Hellenistic times, in the period of prior to the Mishnah. This is not the first time that Jews really argued between themselves as to the proper interpretation of Judaism. There were those who did try to include or adopt Hellenistic ideas, and the inevitable struggle, as you know, led to, I would say, if not ban, but at least the exclusion of all that is Hellenistic Judaism. Hellenistic Judaism is not part of the mainstream of Judaism. The discussion, for example, around the canonization of the Bible, which books to include and which books not to include. The so-called, the apocryphal books, the whole apocrypha that was not included. What do we have from Hellenistic Judaism? It was banned, it was censored. Philo is of no consequence in Jewish history, as it developed subsequent to his time. He's studied today, modern times, by scholars. But a Jew, how much influence Philo had on Jews? Zero. So in those days, it was total exclusion of these attempts to reinterpret Judaism in a different way. Okay. All right? Yes?
One more. Were the Christians in Provence interested in Greek philosophy?
Right. This is is a very, very interesting thing because Provence was a place where there was a heated debate, not only among Jews, but also among the Christians. But I have failed to see the parallelism between the two. There is a professor of the Tel Aviv University who tried to see the identity of thought between the Cathars and the mystics of Provence and Catalonia. Shulamit Shachar, she wrote about women also in the Middle Ages. I am not convinced, having read what she wrote, I am not convinced that she has, I don't say that there isn't any connection, but I'm not convinced that she has found the connection. Now, that's one. The second thing is that the Cathars, or the Albigensian heresy, as they were considered by the establishment at the time, did not present a rationalist, let's say, in inverted commas, Maimonidean interpretation of Christianity, but that people might be better and more knowledgeable than I am as far as this Cathar heresy in Provence, in northern Italy, is concerned. As far as I'm aware, it was not a dispute between a rationalist and non or mystical trends within Christianity. It was a different thing. So, and furthermore, how did the Jews come to be exposed to sciences and philosophy and so on? It was through the translation into Hebrew of dozens of texts, and these were not accessible, I mean, as far as the Christian society was concerned at the time. In any case, I'm not aware that of course, there were translations into Latin, translations into various European languages in the 13th century, but they have not yet. I don't think that the religious agitation in Provence in the end of the 12th century and in the 13th century had much to do with that. But in any case, it's interesting that the Inquisition that began as an ad hoc court to eradicate heresy was established then in order to deal with this problem, and eventually it would deal with Jews as well. But I have not, I'm not aware of such parallelism. All right. Thank you all.
Who's that author?